It's Friday morning, and it's another edition in the continuing series of the Zogby report, Real and Unscripted. And it really is real, and it really is unscripted. Just made up my mind about 60 seconds ago what I should talk about today, or I think we should talk about today, even though there's so much in the news. First of all, how are you doing this week, Jared?
Great. How about you?
Good, thanks. And I'm going to go right up your alley. The economy. There are a lot of cross currents with the economy right now. Of course, the jobs report that came out after we broadcast last week was a dismal jobs report. And at the same time, during the week, the report on inflation was equally dismal, prices growing at 4.6%. Kind of a reminder for those of us who lived in the 70s, what we used to call stagflation, high unemployment and high interest rates, which at that time, 40 plus years ago, ran counter to supply and demand theory. But here we are. There isn't any person alive who's been to a grocery store, shopped retail, bought gas at the pump, who won't tell you that prices are soaring. At the same time, there isn't anybody around who'll tell you that the economy is great and that people are going back to work in record numbers. The economy is the number one issue. What's going on here? Is there a recovery? Are we on the verge of another explosion in the economy? Is this a transitional time, or is this a dangerous time for those of us who have to make a living and those of us who have to buy at the supermarket? I'll let you go first because I know you read a lot and think a lot about this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's been since 2008 that we've had enormous intervention from the Federal Reserve. It's interesting because, you know, I only became aware of the Federal Reserve in 2008. And I suspect that a lot of Americans maybe, you know, heard of the Fed, but never really knew what it was all about. Greenspan, you know, was pretty popular throughout the 90s, but, you know, Greenspan was in an interview quoted as, you know, somebody asked him, what is the role of the Fed in terms of, you know, regarding the other branches of government, the three branches of government. And Alan Greenspan said, it's best that the executive, the president, and the other three branches of government stay out and leave it up to the Fed. And certainly since Greenspan and since 2008, we've had no shortage of intervention. There's more awareness of the Federal Reserve. I've seen in the last 10 years, it seems like the markets hang on every word that whoever is the chairman or chairwoman of the Fed, because we had Janet Yellen before Powell, the market hangs on what they say. And they typically tend to interpret it in a dovish way, you know, that the Fed is going to come in and intervene and provide more liquidity and more QE programs to prop up the market. I once read that traders on the Wall Street Stock Exchange floor are pretty much, by and large, do not remember before 2008 because they're all young. That would mean that they're millennials. So if they only know a scenario of an intervening Fed, they have no context for Paul Volcker. Mm-hmm. I don't think Paul Volcker is the ghost of Paul Volcker, or he's not the ghost, but his legacy is going to come back into the day. Remember, Paul Volcker, in response to the decade of the 70s crisis of runaway inflation, responded by jacking interest rates up to 18, 19, 20% to fight off inflation. We can't do that because if the Federal Reserve were to allow interest rates to go up to, I think, even 3 or 4% or 4 or 5%, the United States would have to default on its debt. So long story short is we have seen nothing but intervention since 2008. And I don't think the Fed is going to take its foot off the gas. It's had its foot, pedal to the metal since 2008, and it's been 13 years. I don't think what we saw in the previous decade was anything like a recovery. We're still essentially in the same situation, just patching over the cracks in the dam. I can get into more, but I'll stop right there.
Let me ask you a couple of things based on what you said. Without intervention from the Fed and the federal government as well, bailouts in 2008, you would have had unemployment even worse. Without a stimulus package as well, you would have had a collapse of a number of key industries that the auto industry coming to mind, the banking industry certainly, and insurance industry coming to mind, that employ hundreds of thousands of Americans. And how would that have been better without QE?
Well, I mean, essentially, that's to say that we can go QE infinity and that we can keep it as it is for 10, 20 years, but we can't. The financial reckoning has to come. And so all that's been done is the Federal Reserve has been putting it off and kicking the can down the road. And as you kick the can down the road and inject more money into the economy, and more people go into debt and the government goes more into debt, you're just ensuring that when the day actually comes that the piper has to be paid and the correction has to take place, it's going to be worse. So what they should have done is they should have listened to Main Street. I think Main Street, by and large, would have preferred to, instead of with their tax dollars, bail out Goldman Sachs and all of these people who were directly responsible for the mayhem and for the misallocation of capital and blowing up the bubble. I mean, they did that, right? They should have stepped back. The Federal Reserve, they should have let whatever industries were going to go down. And I mean, you would have had other companies come in, buy them out, and make them better off, make them more economical, more efficient. That's what would have happened. I'm not saying that there wouldn't have been, pain.
And the key to that efficiency would have been automation, the use of cheaper labor with technology. You could hire someone from the India Institute of Technology for $21,000 that you have to pay somebody here $150,000. In other words, to employees at the various levels here in the United States, pulling the plug on Fed intervention, pulling the plug on federal spending like infrastructure and the like would have been short to long-term pain for millions. Is that an answer?
Well, this is what I'm saying isn't theoretical. We have a case study, and I brought the case study up 3 times. Although I have to say that I've misrepresented this case study. This is the Depression of 20 and 21 that the new administration under Warren G. Harding had to face following World War I. I highly encourage people to look up his inaugural address. We don't know much about Warren G. Harding, but what you'll see there, and look, I mean, let's be honest, inaugural addresses and speeches don't necessarily mean that's what that person means, but it does give you kind of what the zeitgeist is of the moment. And his is a very passionate speech talking about the effects of war. That when war not only destroys lives, it destroys capital that you can never get back. And so he understood full well that a very serious situation was on the horizon for America. There was a depression. And so in previous episodes, when talking about the depression of 20 and 21 under Harding, I said he simply did nothing. Well, actually, that's a misrepresentation. That's kind of like in the realm of foreign policy. If you get somebody like Ron Paul, who says, I'm anti-war, we're not going to war unless we're attacked. There is no preemptive war. It's only the just theory of war, which is in self-defense after you're attacked, you have the right to defend yourself. And then people bash him and they say, well, you're an isolationist. Well, that's not true, because, you know, people of that mindset believe in trade. And there's a classic saying that if goods don't move across the border, troops do. And I think Ron Paul and people of that ilk are well aware of the fact that it's not about isolation, it's about non-intervention. To take that analogy of the depression of 20 and 21, which I incorrectly said Warren G. Harding did nothing. Here's what Warren G. Harding did. First off, he slashed the government bureaucracy by 50%.
5-0.
5-0, by half. He made sure that there wouldn't be additional money creation. He, in effect, reduced the national debt by a third. And what you started to see was, at that moment that he took the presidency, unemployment was at 12%. By the next year, it went down to 6%. By the following year, it went down to 2.5%. So he didn't intervene like what's going on today with Bernanke, like what happened with Bernanke, what happened with Yellen, what's happening now with Powell. He encouraged efficiency, and he took the allocation of a growing government and redirected it towards the economy. Now, people would say, well, hey, if you cut the government in half, that's going to create unemployment. But here's a perfect case study where the unemployment was at 12%, and by reducing the government, the size of federal government, by half, the following year, and all the while not intervening in the economy, it went down to 6%, and the following year it went down to 2.5%.
So two caveats, because I've done a little history myself, and one is that throughout the period of the 1920s, the official unemployment rate was 12 to 13% each year. I'm not aware of any drops to 6% and 2.5%. And you're my son, and I certainly trust that you've read it. I just want to see that evidence, because it isn't from anything that I've ever read. But the second, I think, equally important point is that fast forward to today, are you suggesting in any way that the stimulus package that was passed in the early, let's go back to the late Trump administration, and now the first round in the early Biden administration, were not necessary and did not have an impact on the economy at all in a positive way?
A lot of that has to do with the response to the pandemic. And the states that closed saw a lot of pain. And the states that opened, now I know that obviously, if I remember correctly, you had surging cases, but now let's fast forward today and let's look at Texas and Florida, who have officially reopened since, I don't know, February or March. They don't have surging cases. So what's going on there? So I think that's the factor of shutting down the economy. What we're talking about goes further back. So those are two different variables. I would just say that if we continue down this road of intervention and money creation, you're ultimately at some point going to sacrifice the dollar. I know of no case in history where you can inflate your way out of a depression. I feel like if that were true, I feel like not that we would have reached utopia, but we would know the magic bullet. We would have learned that long ago, because governments have been inflating and debasing currencies, going back to before the ancient Greeks. They had different tools and different ways of doing it, but it fails every time. So it's a double-edged sword. You either face the immediate to prepare yourself for a future recovery, or you say, well, I don't want to risk that in the short term, but in the long term, you kill the currency. And so I think that's where we're at today. I don't know when that happens, but I just know from history that you don't inflate your way out of a depression. Now, the MMTers, the modern monetary theorists, seem to think that, basically, I mean, it's more technical than this, but the government can't ever, it can't ever do that. All it needs to do is really just write a check to pay off its debt and to pay for everything. Again, if that were true, I think we would have seen a golden age for centuries, because governments have been effectively inflating their currencies since the beginning of civilization.
All right, we'll end it there. Anytime you and I have this discussion, it always revolves around, what do you do in the short term? How do you mitigate the worst possible impact in the short and midterm among those who are directly going to be hurt by shutting off the spigot, so to speak. All right, so let's move on to, there's a whole bunch of things, but here's one news flash.
Could I just say one thing about the unemployment? I mean, maybe what you saw was after Harding. I mean, we remember that Harding may very well have been assassinated, right? He died of food poisoning on the equivalent of Air Force One back then. It wasn't called Air Force One, but he was flying on what the president would fly on, and he died of food poisoning, very mysteriously. So that was very. I don't think he fit. He didn't finish off his term. But then after that, you had Coolidge and Hoover. Now it's gone down in textbook history that Hoover was a laissez-faire kind of guy. No, Warren G. Harding was a laissez-faire kind of guy. Hoover was an interventionist, and the Fed after Harding was very interventionist. They blew up a bubble. That's why we had the Roaring '20s. That's what led to the 20s.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah.
So what I'm saying is those unemployment numbers that you saw, I think, probably came after Harding.
Okay. Yeah. No, Hoover. I've read Murray Rothbard and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and there were other initiatives that put money directly in the hands of people. All right, Elise Stefanik just now has been elected to the number 3 position in the House GOP, obviously, as we know, replacing Liz Cheney. It's interesting because, as widely reported, Liz Cheney and her conservatism were much more in line with Donald Trump's conservatism. Elise Stefanik is a prototypical New York Republican, meaning that in the grand scheme of things has been a moderate conservative, but the one big disagreement was over the so-called big lie, whether the election was stolen or not. And the House GOP has certainly taken the Trump line that the 2020 election was stolen. What do you think? What do you think of Elise Stefanik? Does she have a future? She says that she is only going to accept this position in the House for 1 term. It's been rumored that she may run for governor against Andrew Cuomo, although just this week she gave a statement suggesting that she was not going to run for governor. She is only 36 years of age. But what do you think? What's going to happen to the Republican Party in the short term? Does all this infighting hurt it? Or do you think as long as they rally around Donald Trump, they're still contenders in 2022 and 2024?
I have a general sense. This is intuition. This is feeling. This is what I'm hearing on the street. We haven't done a poll on this to back it up with data, But it seems to be, we know that on the right, they're fed up.
Mhm.
But interestingly enough, I think on the left, that some of the Democrats are also starting to get fed up. I think they're starting to get fed up with Anthony Fauci. I think they're starting to get fed up with what more people perceive to be the shifting of the goalpost, and maybe a general sense that's starting to brew. I don't know if I would say it's reached critical mass in the sense of a majority, maybe that the sense that, hey, a bunch of us got vaccinated and we're told that this is supposed to help us. Why the heck can't we take off our masks? Now, yesterday, the CDC and Joe Biden said, well, now we're saying if you got vaccinated, now you can take off the mask indoors. But I think that was in response to what I'm saying. I think they were starting to realize that the public is getting really tired of this. And they've sacrificed a lot over the last year and a half. So with that said, if we continue to see, and we talked about this last week, you actually brought it up and I built on it, that there is a potential for a third party. I don't know if Trump goes away, but if elements within the Republican Party try to derail MAGA, I think you only increase the likelihood of a third party, more than likely breaking off from the Republicans. I mean, I think I saw last week 100 members of Congress in the Republican Party was it that they were threatening to leave?
It's 100 former Bush and former Trump officials that were talking about leaving the Republican Party and possibly forming a third party. That's a whole discussion unto itself. And I'll tell you what, let's save that one for next week. And then in the interests of continuing with controversial, let's talk about Israel and Gaza next week as well. And let's see what happens, sadly, between now and next week. But those will be our two items.
I elect that we talk about Israel and Palestine now.
All right, do we have time? All right, how about a 2-minute tease?
You tee it up because you know the Middle East very well.
Yeah. All right. So I think what folks in this country don't get is that the presence of Israel in the Middle East is the last bastion of Western imperialism and colonialism. Essentially, what it is granting for understandable and personally sensitive philanthropic reasons, granting portion of land that historically was Israel to Jews who suffered during the Holocaust, have suffered throughout history. And the idea of the state of Israel was a noble humanitarian effort. By the same token, it essentially planted or replanted Westerners into the middle of an Arab world. And its impact was not benign from the outset. From the outset, there were battles over property, battles over land. There was famous in 1948 Plan D, Plan Dalit, where IDF, Israeli Defense Force general, cleared out entire villages, including massacring the residents of Deir Yassin, forcing hundreds of thousands of Arabs into Jordan, into Lebanon, pushed up into the north towards Haifa. Anyway, all of that is just necessary background. But the fundamental problem is that Israel won land in 1967, and the United Nations resolution 242 says there cannot be peace in that region between Israel and the Palestinians unless Israel withdraws and turns over those one lands, essentially the West Bank and Gaza, over to the Palestinians for the formation of an independent Palestinian state. Israel does not recognize that Proposition 242, claims that it has a right to exist, but its right to exist is based on United Nations resolution of 1948, which it accepts, but doesn't accept the United Nations resolution 242, which calls for it to withdraw. In the meantime, whether it's Labor government or Likud government or the coalition governments that Netanyahu has been able to form, Israel still maintains an aggressive policy of building settlements for mainly right-wing, very aggressive Jewish settlers and building them on Palestinian-owned land and clearing Palestinians off of West Bank land, and as we are seeing, clearing them off of land in East Jerusalem. And so essentially, this war that we're in right at this moment is that as background, but most immediately, number one, Palestinians protested because they feel that they are being forced from the land that they own in Jerusalem. And secondly, this was Ramadan and eventually the Eid, and Palestinians were worshiping the holiest day of the year at one of the holiest temples or symbols of the Islamic religion, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Israel violated that by coming in using tear gas and arresting Palestinians. It's not right, and I'm troubled that the best that the Biden administration could come up with was Israel has a right to defend itself without talking at all about Palestinian rights as well.
Yeah. Well, we have a very smart listener out in Wisconsin that from time to time gives me their take on events. And I have to say, we had some communication back and forth over this past week. And I think this person is spot on that the general idea is that look at the timeline, what was going on before all this started. And of course, Bibi was facing some serious corruption charges, which is not unusual for Mr. Bibi. It seems to be he's always facing corruption charges, but this one was particularly serious. The second thing was that there was the potential for a coalition between, if I have my information correct, between the conservatives and the Arabs. And of course, the election was around the corner. And then also there's this notion of carrying on the Obama legacy of the JCPOA that Biden, I think, wants to do. So with those three or four things, starting a war effectively buys time and kills that. And so that's classic wagging the dog. That's a very popular move that was used by Bill Clinton. And I tend to believe that Bibi and Clinton are of similar ilk. So I would not put it past him. That's something that I'm not going to say to our listeners, believe it, but look into it and decide for yourselves. It seems very plausible.
It's pretty conspiratorial for me, but it's worth thinking about. It is worth thinking about. That coalition between the conservatives and the Arab bloc, for a majority of the Knesset, was talked about, but likely not going to happen. It's essentially ingrained in Israeli elections that no Israelis form coalitions with Arabs, that in fact it becomes a rallying cry for the other side. But the other elements of what you just laid out could very well be true. And it could be, in particular, you mentioned JCPOA. That is the broader coalition that made the Iran nuclear deal that the Netanyahu and the government and right-wing parties vehemently opposed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's continue this. Not that this, we don't mean to be real and spontaneous. We do, but this issue will be with us next week, I'm sure.
Yeah, more than likely. So
more than likely. Okay, good discussion.
All right. Signing off, and have a good weekend. Have a great weekend.
Okay, I'll see you later. You too. Bye-bye.